Thank you, David. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, Mike Pugh, who is counsel in the New York office of Latham and Watkins. He specializes in sports law-related matters as well as corporate law. He was lead outside counsel in the creation of the National Women's Soccer League, as well as the United States' bid to host the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Mike represented the USOC in connection with the 2024 Olympic bidding process, and he also served as counsel to NYC 2012, which was the City of New York's bid committee for the 2012 Olympic Games. He received his law degree from NYU, undergraduate degree from Swarthmore. Mike, hand it to you.
Thanks, Jeff, and thank you all for having me here today. As the transactional attorney, not the litigator up here, I come at this from, I think, a slightly different angle, thinking about issues of, and some of those issues have come up already, about governance. As Jeff just mentioned, I represented the World Cup bid for the United States, which lost to Qatar, represented New York City's bid to host the Olympic Games, which lost to London, makes me a two-time loser. Continue to represent the United States Soccer Federation, National Women's Soccer League, and recently represented the Copa Centenario, a large international soccer tournament that was held here in the United States. That being said, I obviously, and I suspect this goes for most of the lawyers up here, I'm speaking on my own behalf and not on behalf of my clients, so I just want to give that a disclaimer here. And I want to talk a little bit about governance and good governance, and what do I mean by good governance? So the things I think about as a corporate attorney when we want to reform governance of an entity, we think about identifying who the stakeholders in that entity are and what obligations are owed to those stakeholders, and how do we treat those stakeholders equitably, what duties are owed to them. Similarly, the board, what duties does the board have? How does the board operate? How do you delineate the responsibilities of the board? You think about within the entity, systems of checks and balances, conflicts of interest, codes of ethics. You think about anti-bribery, anti-corruption measures, and you think about disclosure and transparency. And as Gareth mentioned, virtually none of these things existed in the world of international sports until very recently. That being said, I think international sports is unique in its desperate need for these, not simply because it hasn't had them, but because of the world in which it operates. First of all, by its nature, international sports is international. That means it has different countries with different codes of law, different standards of law, and also different cultures about what is permitted in business ethics and what is not. One example I think that's come up recently is the whole concept of commercial bribery, which we have here in the United States, they have in the UK, is in most nations in the world a completely foreign concept. In other words, offering an individual money individually in order to convince them to do something on behalf of their principal. So if they're an agent or fiduciary, is not unusual. It's accepted. And as Gareth mentioned comically, it was tax deductible in Switzerland until recently. So we're dealing with international entities that by their nature have so many different codes of law and culture around this that I think good governance is especially needed. Furthermore, it's not clear often who the stakeholders are in these international sports entities and what their interests are. And part of it is because in a corporation, it's pretty clear to identify who the stakeholders are. You have your stockholders, perhaps you have customers you might identify as stakeholders. International sports, you have the athletes, you have the fans, you have host cities, you have host nations, you have, and all of these, and you have the sponsors, and you have the broadcasters, they all compete, they all have different interests. And some sense of what duties are owed to them and how you balance those duties is, I think, especially important. You also have, recently, in the last 20, 30 years, tremendous amounts of money in sport, which you didn't have for a long time. I really see the watershed event of when money really started to flow into sports as the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games, chaired by Peter Ueberroth. Prior to that, there wasn't as much money. So was there a need for good governance? Perhaps there's always a need for good governance, but I think of the Willie Sutton line when asked why he robs banks, purportedly, he said, because that's where the money is. The reason you need good governance in sports is because there's a lot of money there. And just a quick illustration, the 1980 Lake Placid Winter Olympic Games, so that was, the ABC had the broadcast rights for that. They paid, I believe it was $15.5 million for those 1980 Winter Olympic Games rights. 8 years later, the games were in Calgary. The Winter Games were in Calgary. So same continent, same set of games. 8 years later, the exact same network, ABC, paid over $300 million for those same rights. So in that span from 1980 to 1984, the rights values on the broadcast rights in the United States increased 20-fold. And since then, if you look at the chart, they've continued, rights, broadcast rights, sponsorship rights, marketing rights have continued to skyrocket. So there's a lot of money in sport. We all know that. And that's another reason that sport is in especially good need of governance. And then the last reason I just want to identify here is that the currency in which sport deals is, I think, uniquely susceptible to illicit behavior. So what does sport do? Well, not only is there a lot of money there, but there are tickets to world-class events. There are opportunities to hobnob with political leaders, with celebrities, whether they're movie stars or international sports celebrities. What FIFA, what the IOC sell, what they market, is VIP hospitality experiences. So the very currency in which international sport deals, I think, is uniquely susceptible to misdeeds. So that's why I think of all the entities and sectors out there, international sport especially needs good governance, and as we've all discussed, it hasn't had good governance. Now, Gareth, I think, went through most of the reasons why it doesn't have good governance, and that they were Swiss not-for-profits. Switzerland tended to protect them. The law certainly shielded them. That there was a sense of non-interference in Switzerland, that a lot of them, and David touched on this too, that a lot of the leaders were not very sophisticated. They were ex-athletes. A lot of the leaders in international sports now, particularly from outside the United States, led small, say, football associations in their home country and suddenly found themselves awash in money, where for decades it was a family-run business that frankly didn't have much business in terms of not much money. So there's a long history here of why there wasn't much good governance. And there are two other points I'd like to make. One is, as I said, in the 1970s, and business historians will tell you, I guess, that the good governance movement in the United States in particular really began in the 1970s as corporations really started to reform themselves and rethink their boards or fiduciary duties, conflicts of interest, ethics codes, et cetera. Well, at that time there was not a lot of need, so the thought went, in sports for good governance because there wasn't a lot of money yet. The other reason I think there hasn't been a lot of history of good governance in sports is frankly because a lot of the stakeholders are in on the scam. If you are a potential sponsor and you are bidding to sponsor an international event, a World Cup, an Olympic Games, the World Track and Field Champions, tennis, et cetera, you may lose out and you may suspect it was because of foul play. But the brutal truth is that most of the other sponsors out there are engaging in foul play, and you probably are too. And so very few of them were going to blow the whistle on behavior that they acknowledged they also engaged in. So there wasn't a lot of demand among the stakeholders for better governance. So just to sort of fast forward to today, is there good governance now? So I would say, or are there examples of better governance now? I think governance is improving. I suspect some of the panelists up here may disagree. And I don't want to say that as a blanket. I wouldn't give the IOC or FIFA, nobody gets an A. But perhaps if grading on a curve, you could get some Bs or B pluses out there. there are pockets of good governance, and I'm very familiar with FIFA, and so let me talk about some of the things you're seeing in FIFA today. And these are all steps in the right direction, not an exhaustive list. FIFA has, in large part thanks to the work of Transparency International, FIFA now has term limits for a number of its leaders. For the president is limited to 3 4-year terms, and for the FIFA Council, which is what we all used to be called the Executive Committee, so that also rebranded FIFA Executive Committee became FIFA Council. But the FIFA Council also has term limits on it too, and that is the group. It was the group of 24 leaders of FIFA who made most decisions. I think they're now expanding it to a little bit over 30, I believe. 37, is that right? So they're expanding it to 37. FIFA also has put in place a number of independent directors on its committees, and that is definitely a step in the right direction, certainly something we see in corporate America. Voting has been an interesting aspect to all of this. So FIFA has re-examined its voting process, and the World Cup, the host nation for the World Cup used to be determined by this elite group of the EXCO, the Executive Committee, of 24 leaders of FIFA, although the 2018 and 22 World Cups were determined by the 22-member Executive Committee because 2 of them had been banned at the time. So, and there's a great story about why at least one of those seats wasn't filled, which we won't get into all of the details, but the short version is because the Qataris realized that the replacement for that seat would likely vote against the Qatar bid for 2022, and therefore helped that nation or helped that individual fund a fight against FIFA to fight his ban. And so long as his fight was ongoing, that they could not replace him. So the Qataris were very effective at preventing that potential vote against them from being seated. In any event, so voting has been interesting. So FIFA has now expanded part of the voting, not exclusively, but part of the voting for the World Cup from that formerly 22, 24, now 37-member committee to its full member committee of 200, the full Congress of 209 bidders, with an idea being that by dispersing it among those voters, that would bring more integrity to the process. I actually leave that as a question. I don't know if that brings more integrity to the process. Interestingly, meanwhile, the IOC is considering, at least one member of the IOC is considering doing the exact opposite, that taking the, I think it's 96 voters on the IOC, taking the decision of which host city from the 96 vote body down to its executive committee of, I think it's 15 members. So that's actually just a governance question. Which is a more effective system that yields more integrity, transparency. One other question, and again, to pose it as a question that we can think about when we think about governance and voting, is whether or not transparent voting. We have the closed ballot box, right? And we don't know how everybody's voting. We guess. There's a lot of analysis about how nations vote, how representatives vote. But perhaps you could have transparency in voting, might yield more honesty. It would certainly make it a lot tougher to vote trade. One of the best examples of what happens routinely in the voting process is you'll have a single member will sell his or her vote to more than one buyer. I always think of the John Breaux quote, my vote's not for sale, but it's certainly for rent. And I think if you had more transparency in voting, if you knew how people vote, certainly that potential voter would get away with that only one more time. And after that, it'd be a lot harder to buy that. There'd be a lot fewer buyers for that vote. There are also organizational changes that FIFA is going through right now, which may or may not be helpful. I think some of them have been very welcome. There is an independent audit and compliance committee that is slated to, I don't think it's started working yet, but it is slated to monitor effectively all FIFA activity. And that, I think, is going to be a welcome change. There have also been some changes in the org chart, and I just put this up here. This is the new FIFA. And I just put this up here to flag one thing. Down at the bottom of that chart, you have marketing services and TV services. Again, to use the Willie Sutton quote, that's where the money is. Those services used to report effectively directly to the Secretary General. I think there was one layer between them. They are now, as you see, multiple layers below the Secretary General. I'm not sure if moving where the money is that far below the Secretary General is going to be a welcome change. But that's one other activity, one other thing that's gone on is there have been organizational changes within FIFA. One of the most noted changes, I think that is a welcome org change, structural change within FIFA, is one of the great sources of corruption, of misdeeds, where there were two programs, FAP, which I think stood for the FIFA Assistance Program, I may have that wrong, Football Assistance Program, and GOAL. And those were essentially pork barrel politics by FIFA. You know, frankly, not unlike what we may see in Congress. But those were the programs by which the president of FIFA and really was able to designate funds to individual programs within member nations for the good of football. But they certainly tended to go where the FIFA president needed political support. And it was, by the way, astounding to me as you read these examples of how these programs, GOAL and FAP, were being used. Astounding to me how little money it took to buy votes. The FIFA president could designate $30,000 to light a football pitch in an African country. Remember, it's one vote, one country. So $30,000, and suddenly that member of the FIFA Congress would vote for the president. It was very effective, and in many instances not that expensive. So that program has now been replaced by something called Forward, which I have high hopes for. On the one hand, there's a lot more money in Forward than there was in FAP and GOAL. And the reason for that is Gianni Infantino, the new president of FIFA, essentially ran on the platform of, I'll put a lot more money in this, I'll get all of you federations, football federations, a lot more money. So you can understand why they voted for him. On the other hand, he has promised, and we will see how it's implemented, that those programs under Forward will have milestones, they will have clear metrics, they will be held to account. And so that, I think, is potentially a welcome change. And talk briefly also, when you think about governance, I mentioned ethics codes, ethics committees. There's been some steps in the right direction. When the IOC took what I think were some great steps forward in the late 1990s following the Salt Lake scandal, and it really did, I think, it had a lot of productive changes. One of the comments I'd make is that the IOC's ethics committee that investigated that was made up entirely of IOC members. It was the foxes guarding the hen house. That being said, I think they did a generally pretty good job, generally. But FIFA is now not doing that. FIFA now has actual independent members on its audit and compliance committee and on a number of its significant committees, and I think that is a welcome change. That being said, FIFA also has created a new set of ethics committees. So FIFA, by the way, didn't even have an ethics code or an ethics committee until 2004. And its initial ethics code and ethics committee were toothless. I remember reading the ethics code, and it was, I don't know, call it 4 or 5 pages. I felt like it was when I was in 7th grade doing a term paper, right? It was like 4 or 5 pages, large print, wide margins. And it's now vastly improved. I think they're up to about 60 pages, still wide margins, but the print's a lot smaller. So we're moving in the right direction. And it has these it had an ethics committee that was completely toothless. It was not able to investigate anything. All it could do was it could act on a complaint that had been filed with it. So it had no ability to investigate beyond that. And by the way, and Mohammed bin Hammam was one of the members of that initial ethics committee. He now has been banned from football for life, so it did not have an illustrious set of members. Now there are 2 committees. There's an investigatory committee and an adjudicatory committee. I will say I think they've been off to a rocky start. It came in, there was a lot in the media when Michael Garcia, who was a former U.S. attorney, was head of the investigatory committee and did a, I don't know, call it 400-page report on the 2018-2022 bidding process, which FIFA didn't release, and finally the adjudicatory committee released a version of it that was so scaled down and so inaccurate, according to Michael Garcia, that Michael Garcia quit. Currently, they are investigating the new president of FIFA. We have very high hopes for him. He's already under investigation for travel against FIFA policies. And the report on him was supposed to be submitted by the investigatory committee to the adjudicatory committee, I think several weeks ago. It still hasn't been submitted. Nobody knows why. But the rumor is because the investigatory committee is so hopelessly deadlocked, they're not sure what to submit. So I think they've moved generally in the right direction. I think they're having a lot of trouble getting it all off the ground. The final comments I would make on this deal with when we think about good governance. So I mentioned transparency and disclosure. I think, as I said, there's an audit and compliance committee. I think we're moving in the right direction. I would say this, and again, this is a question for everybody to think about. I think that some of the problems historically with FIFA in particular and international sport, and David talked a lot about this, with the geopolitical problems. And I think those are very tough to encourage transparency and disclosure that will actually get at those problems. You know, and I just want to give a handful of examples, and then I really ask it as a question: how do you get at these sorts of issues? One of the issues was during the bidding for 2018 and 2022. This back up a little bit. Sarkozy, the president of France, called in Michel Platini, legendary French footballer, happened to be head of UEFA and happened to be a member of the FIFA Executive Committee, calls in Michel Platini and encourages him, this has come out, to strongly support Qatar. Why does Sarkozy want the president of France care? Why does he care about this? He cares about this because at the time, Airbus, a French company, was trying to win business to sell airplanes to Qatar Air. And sure enough, Platini supports Qatar vocally. 6 months before the voting, Qatar Air announces a plan to expand its buy from Airbus. There's this, as David talked about, there's this geopolitical, there's an economic development side to this also that I think it's very hard to get at the disclosure that would capture those sorts of deals. By the way, as a footnote to it, Qatar Air is now suing Airbus because the planes didn't get delivered on time. But there are other examples too. Franz Beckenbauer from Germany, again another legendary footballer, supported Qatar. In Qatar right now, they're building a new metro system being designed and built by a German company. A number of the legendary outdoor air conditioning that we've heard a lot about is all being designed by German engineers. And a number of the stadiums in Germany, in Qatar, are being designed by Albert Speer architects. By the way, thinking about rebranding, it's amazing to me that Albert Speer Architects still exists. But anyway, it does, under that name. And Albert Speer is designing, not himself, but is designing a number of the stadiums. So there are one other example I would give, just because it's another fascinating one, and then I'll stop. And the question, right, for all of these is how do you get at these issues? Is that Thailand had a vote on the executive committee for the 2022 World Cup. Now, Thailand had done a huge deal. The Thailand natural gas company had done a huge deal with the Qatari gas company for delivery at a fixed price. Shortly after they signed the deal, it was a 10-year deal, shortly after they signed the deal, natural gas prices plummeted. Thailand was opening this huge new import facility and was stuck buying gas at a price far above market. So what ends up happening is that Thailand, that the Qatari member of the executive committee, in recognition of this, prevails upon Qatar Gas to recut the deal with Thailand, with the Thailand Gas Company, which happened to be a sponsor of the Thailand Football Association. They recut the deal against their own interest to spot price the gas sold to the Thailand Gas Company, which was the sponsor of the Thailand FA, and sure enough, the head of the Thailand FA being the Football Association, sure enough, the head of the Thailand Football Association, which is one of the 22 voters for the Qatari World Cup, for the 2022 World Cups, votes for Qatar. So there's, just as a general question, it's very tough, even with enhanced disclosure, I think, how do you figure out how you get at all of these? That's it for now. Thanks.